your screen recording. Hope nobody minds that we're recording this session. We want to thank you for joining the first webinar of 2014 entitled Design Review, Standards and Practice. And we encourage you to become a member of CPF and enjoy the benefits and educational discounts. Information on membership can be found on our website at californiapreservation.org. The California Preservation Foundation is a member-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. The format for today's webinar will consist of a presentation of design review case examples interspersed with time for audience participation and response. You will be polled for your opinion after each case example. There is a Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and we will hold the question until it can be addressed by a speaker. There is also a chat box, which is visible to all participants. If you would like to comment or interject, you may do so through the chat box. Right now I'm going to show you how to enable the sound on
John, can you hear us?
Taylor.
Yeah.
Begin the presentation, please.
Probably they're all different places. Just where they work. Right, there you go.
All right, Taylor, can you hear me?
Yes, we can both hear you, John.
Okay, please begin the presentation. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. I'm Taylor Loudon. I'll start off with saying welcome and thank you for joining the webinar. We've been presenting at the last 3 conferences a version of this called the Design Roundtable, in case you've been to the conferences before. We've decided to pick probably the highlights from some previous conferences to represent, and most of these either are great examples of a particular project type, multifamily, single-family, institutional, and a modern example. And one of them, the Crystal Cathedral, was presented in Orange last year when it was just at its very initial stages. And we have the preservation architect involved with that, Barbara Lamprecht, who'll be presenting what's been developed since this past year. I'm not sure how to advance the images, so I'll just say we could go to the first image, which would be the Painted Gentleman project from San Francisco.
Well, so up on the right-hand side, you see the green bar. Okay, well, he's figuring it out. Get rid of that. There we are. Okay. He's figuring it out. You're higher, John.
Okay.
I've seen this before. It's easy to figure out.
Okay, so I hope it goes smoother too. So what everybody should be seeing now on their computer is the project that we considered a couple of years ago at the Oakland conference, and it's presented by the architect and the developer. And for those of you who are familiar with the Design Roundtable, basically what happens is the architect or the developer or the planner or somebody involved in the project presents the scheme that describes what the project is using the images that you'll see. And then we have design comments by a panel of reviewers. So we're really going to do the same process here. And I will take this first one as the presenter and tell you that this is a project at a site that everybody is very familiar with because of the painted ladies. And you see the painted ladies, which are these very Victorian, Italianate-style residential structures, and in the background is the modern skyline of San Francisco. It's a postcard that everybody has seen. And in this case, we have a project where there was a site directly adjacent to the Painted Ladies that a developer assembled, and it's at 802, 804, and 808 Steiner Street. And it puts directly in the context of the Painted Ladies, how do you do new construction in not only a historic district, but in a very visually influential one. Not sure how we go to the next slide, John, unless it's that arrow there. Okay. So in the presentation, what we're looking at are the, the classic tools of the trade. How do you show what went on and what was there in the past? So we presented Sanborn maps from 1900 and circa 1950 that shows where the project site is. And then you see at the right where it says Alamo Historic District, the existing conditions of the residence that was actually survived the fire of the San Francisco earthquake. On the next image, this is the basic design concept of taking the original building and removing the later alterations of the roof, and then having additions to that, and the existing site plan is showing how it was added on over time. And the next image is the proposed design, which shows the infill, which is to the left of the screen below the two shaded houses, and those are that's the existing infill. So it's a classic example of a residential infill. These images show on the right, of course, of the Great Fire shot, and then the existing conditions as of a few years ago in the context, which shows those very same houses still standing and there. And here is probably the best view of what the design proposal was, which is building in for that addition essentially to one of those original residences, the design proposal. So you're looking at one of the ideas of this, which is how much do you replicate the original building? And these are the studies that were shown by the architect and developer for the early design, which was, how do you do this? Do you make it be demonstrably different? And maybe on the upper right, that's more of an example of that. On the upper left, how do you define the entrances, and how much are they open or solid, and how modern could they be, yet still maintain a pedimented roof line? These are more studies, and it shows actually a very good vision of what the Steiner Street panoramic view is, and shows you the context, which is everything, especially in this project. And at the top, the facades that attempted to differentiate the three structures to look like they were designed maybe by different people and maybe at different times, but effectively we know it's the same construction process. And these are more examples of how else could this design be successful. Different colors, different vegetation. The pediment is now a lot more abstracted in this, and then in that's the final slide. So in effect, what I think we're going to leave to the design reviewers to discuss is how successful is this project in whatever iteration at trying to put together an appropriate residential infill design that doesn't necessarily replicate classical or neoclassical details, but attempts a modern version of the same, and how successfully did this come forward and be accepted by a preservation design review board. So with that, we can now open it up to the reviewers, and the reviewers will be, for the purposes of our webinar, Lambert and Barbara and myself. So are there any questions from the reviewers?
No, that was well presented, Taylor.
Taylor, which was actually, were these actually constructed?
At the time this was presented at the Oakland conference 2 years ago, this was just finishing design review. And it had, the last image that you were left with was what they had decided to go with. I'm not positive if it's been constructed. I don't know the answer to that.
Mm-hmm.
This project raises, some very important concepts, clearly in terms of site planning and how one is going to build in an historic context. So I think it's certainly a very relevant project for a lot of the issues that architects deal with designing, in the historic built environment. I think that when we look at kind of the evolution of this design, I think there certainly were a number of alternatives explored. My sense is that it's great, Taylor, that you changed the name to Painted Gentleman, because I think there's a question of sort of delicacy and scale that come up. Clearly there's an attempt to be more contemporary, but sort of perhaps fighting this concept of some of the lines being evocative of the existing house on the corner, which is maybe a completely different scale relative to the typical San Francisco row house, which we see a little further down the block. So again, it hits the mark in terms of site plan and how, the pattern of development is in fact the row house, which I think the earlier scheme, I don't recall when that was built, Taylor. Was that in the 1960s, the earlier edition?
I think so.
So, that got it in terms of sort of the site plan, where it might have been a little more blocky and didn't in fact take advantage of the height. I think, sort of the projects from the get-go were the right pattern. So the question now becomes just sort of detail, and should it be more reminiscent of the house on the corner, or more literally take its clues from the row houses further down the block? Barbara?
Well, how do I get out of the poll and back to the last image?
I think you can hit your back button.
On the lower left, it will have an arrow facing left or right.
Oh, that was extinguished when the poll was up.
Oh, where would you like to go?
Can you try your arrows?
I'm here. That was helpful. I guess for me there's two different questions here. How successful is this, and then is it appropriate for the project? And oops, now it's going all the way back.
What image would you like to see?
I see it. I have the
okay.
one I want to see. And I guess I think that it's kind of, there's a literal interpretation with regard to the roof line, so that it adopts existing conditions, but the design is so, the facades are so kind of disjointed. It's so literal in terms of replicating the rhythm of the roof line, and then using these three with similar facades. So there's kind of a disjointed color.
Better than a lot of things.
Line and that
better than federal
sediment and what happens below that. And so it's possibly quite successful in terms of what the parameters of the brief are. Architecturally, it seems to be more disjointed as far as I'm concerned.
And as I recall, Barbara, when this was presented, that was one of the key components of what people questioned. It was not so much that were you getting it as a modern reinterpretation of a neoclassically designed building, but how successful was it in differentiating the three buildings from each other? And in this scheme, okay, one's got a half round, one's a flat bay projecting, the other one's an angular bay projecting, so it almost looks cartoonish, and I think the colors don't necessarily help it out. At a certain point, except the fact that they're row houses and that they don't necessarily need to be differentiated from each other. The other point that was brought up by a landscape architect that was on the panel 2 years ago was, what are you actually doing with the landscaping there? It doesn't convey anything except the little bit of spinach in a tray at the front of the garage. So why would you, if you're going to differentiate by different colors, at least, you know, maybe something should be done with the landscaping to help reinforce the fact that these are 3 different buildings with 3 different owners eventually.
Well, and it also raises the question of how one kind of going through the design process, how one, you know, again, is struggling with concepts of making it appear more contemporary versus making it a more literal replication. And I know that, you know, in many cases, people don't like the concept of literal replication. However, I always find that even if one sort of draws it up as a literal replication, it's through the materials and the detailing that you might then give a nod towards a more contemporary design. And in some ways that's safer, because then you sort of, in many cases, can avoid this overscaled design, which is kind of what ended up here. And even the pediment, I think that, you know, it was referred to at the design roundtable at the conference as perhaps being a little too, you know, ski chalet on top of row house. So I think, you know, again, looking at how one might literally draw the houses down the street, but then look at window systems and exterior materials to make it feel absolutely contemporary and of its time.
Oh, you've got a point.
It feels, to me, there's a quality of kind of desperation to follow the standards or to follow the brief, but to not exploit the opportunity for detail and integration between, you know, this pediment at the top and the lower 2 stories.
Right, and maybe almost skip the pediment and deal with a flat roof condition, which is similar to other types of buildings in San Francisco.
You know, at the very least, also, once you start looking at it very closely, in some senses, the earlier schemes worked better because they were really kind of wildly different from each other. And here you get the impression that it's just the same window, but with a slightly different surround. And when you look at all of these, really, they all were playing with pediments, but the one on the top right in this example is the one that I find personally it's sort of the more interesting, because it's not just saying, well, we're going to do a pediment and make it look like a pediment. We're going to look really different. I don't like the below the roof line effect as much, but the fact that you're really manipulating a architectonic volume rather than just replicating it and coming up with a ski chalet look.
But it also says, you know, that there's a conscious, you know, we're going to make it more contemporary in form. And I think one of the tests, again, in terms of as these things are built, is you step away a few blocks and you squint. If it sort of blends in, then it appears to be successful. If it tends to stand out too much, then, you know, perhaps a rethinking. This is John breaking in. I just wanted to move it on to the next project if possible, but also open it up for questions and responses from the audience. And since we're having audio issues right now, I would suggest that people type their questions or responses in the chat box, please.
That's what that is.
Question. One thing I opened on the
It appears
Windows. Right.
it appears that there are no questions, so should we move on to the next project?
Yes, that sounds fine. Sure.
This is I'll present the next project. This is one that we looked at a couple of years ago in one of our historic districts in Highland Park. It's a kind of third structure being added to a single-family lot. The concept was for the owner to have a studio at the back of the property.
So this is the front of the existing contributing property to the Highland Park Historic District. It's also a property that's under the Mills Act. And this is looking at the rear of the property. So what this is helping inform is that there were some later, very kind of minor additions to this property, but the main kind of concept or high style of the Craftsman bungalow is clearly the front. Of the backyard with a driveway and an existing garage where the doors have been converted to French doors. And this is the site plan that the architect developed, which was essentially preserving the main house at the front, which is to the right on the screen. Then in the middle is the garage, and then using what was a fairly large rear yard to accommodate the new guest house. And this is a kind of initial rendering sort of concept. There was clearly a desire here on the part of the architect and the owner to do something that was fairly contemporary in nature. And our office in reviewing the project was not sort of against that concept. I think the issue was how to make the new structure with a fairly large footprint, make it feel, as though it's at least kind of subordinate to the main house. So that also kind of helped dealing with a more stripped down vernacular in terms of the overall design. We also encouraged the architect to look at a model so we could all kind of get our arms around, what would the density of buildings be on the site. Would this in fact be too large of a footprint relative to the third structure? So the model was a great way to kind of look at that in addition to the drawings. There was also a desire, again, in the thought that this structure would be kind of a tertiary structure on the lot. So in kind of a descending order of importance of main house, secondary structure of garage, and now this kind of third structure, and there was a thought of, if the materiality of it were kind of reduced even further than the clapboard siding, what might that be? So this was a concept of, could we use a more basic material, in this case rolled roofing, that was previously used by Schindler on the De Keyser residence, what would that look like? I think we got that concept as far as a mock-up, and then the owner decided it was a little too radical. So again, looking at kind of a study model of how that, kind of a simplified exterior material, in this case it almost looks like shrink wrap, but at least the architect and owner were willing to explore these concepts to make the project kind of fit in. So looking at under framing, the simplified forms I think worked very well in terms of making this appear as minimal as possible on the rear of the lot. So, well, first thing that I would want to say is that in requesting a model be constructed, it's incredibly helpful. Besides the fact that the hand holding the model looks like hand of God and all that, it really lets people see, however they can read drawings, exactly how this will come across as a massing and as a scale. And in my time in the Historic Preservation Overlay Zone reviews here in Los Angeles, I was strongly in favor, not necessarily of models, but the real-life version of the same, which were story poles for anything that was a residential addition, especially a second floor addition to a one-story house. And that's one of the typical issues in HPOZs. In this case, that was less of an issue because the house was clearly in the foreground and the construction was totally within the backyard. It does raise a separate question, although this is really a modified one-story house. It's much more easily seen as that it's more fitting because the massing of the model, again, shows you how well it fits. It's also interesting when you look at the model, which is now on the screen, the difference between a 1912 Craftsman on the right and the original garage, I think, and the addition or the new accessory structure proposed on the left. I think it was an R2 area, so you could have two houses on this one lot. So that was not the issue, but it ends up with the way it was detailed, looking a little bit like a 60s one off of Sea Ranch, but successful in terms of how it, you know, once you look at it just in a massing form the way you see in the model, it's helpful to sort of to understand how well the massing fits, although it's a vastly different style reference.
Okay, Lambert, I have a question from Marissa, actually.
Yes.
She's asking what material was used for the siding.
I think what we ended up with on this was a hardy board, smooth siding with kind of a larger exposure. I think it was 3 times the clapboard on the house, 2 or 3 times the exposure of the clapboard siding on the house is what they ended up with. So kind of a wood reference with a slightly different scale, kind of an exaggerated scale.
Lambert, what purview did the city have over the rear of the property, since this cannot be seen from the street?
Well, in Los Angeles, we tend to take a more holistic view of how we review properties and projects. So whether it's an interior of any property that has character-defining features versus kind of looking at the entirety of the property. I mean, for one issue under Mills Act, since the entire property is covered, we tend to review all of it. So if the property hadn't been under the Mills Act, the historic district review would have weighted the review to what was visible from the front only. But in this case, because the property is under the Mills Act, we tend to look at it holistically in terms of how, you know, architecturally an addition fits the property versus only what's visible, you know, from the public right-of-way.
Thank you.
We haven't been stopped yet by the Supreme Court.
Any day.
Hey, Lambert, I have another question, actually.
Yeah.
The question is, does the listing status of the property, whether national, local, or state, change the design review decision-making process?
Well, in our kind of, LA may not be the best model for how we do that, but for properties that are locally designated, our historic cultural monuments, that's sort of one level of review, which since 1962 has historically included interiors and looking at the property holistically. The next local level is what this property is, which is in an historic district, an approved locally designated historic district. And for the 29 that we currently have, there are preservation plans which define sort of the level of review for properties in those districts. In this case, the property is in a slightly elevated category, as I said earlier, because it's under the Mills Act. But compared to properties that are California Register or National Register, our review in the city of Los Angeles tends to mirror a more kind of contemporary CEQA review, which might only be the exterior of a property, or, you know, and including kind of significant publicly accessible interior spaces. So our pyramid, if you will, in Los Angeles is a little bit upside down because we tend to weight our locally designated and Mills Act properties higher than California Register and National Register. But it really just depends on the nature of the property.
Okay, I have a follow-up question for that, actually. The follow-up question is, does the overlay zone provide design guidelines for backyard landscapes?
Not typically. The preservation plans will talk about landscaping in general, but primarily focus on landscaping that's going to be visible from the public right-of-way. although the historic overlays do include any significant trees, which in some cases are on the rear of properties and thus protected.
Yeah, generally in the HPUZ review, it's the street visible is what's primary, and it's not necessarily the case for what's not visible from the rear. The landscaping is also one of the more dicey, because that tends to be where people feel that they have their yard and they should be able to do what they want, but obviously if you're in a district that had lawns and people want to put in hedges, that's where you have a lot of issues.
Given the very thoughtful spatial layout, it really does seem that the garage, not the garage, but the guest house addition does go a long way to unifying the entire project. And I note, as another participant has pointed out, something that is quite obvious but a good point, is that both of them have this quarter of the mass removed on both sides. So even though the heights are different, the scale is very harmonious, and those two missing quarters kind of speak together to open up the lot even further. I think it's really successful.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, there are no further questions. Should we move on to the next case?
Sure. I'll be responsible for presenting this. I actually ran across this in an Architectural Record magazine when we were putting together the Oakland Design Roundtable. And this was an interesting example from the standpoint of it's a performing arts center, and it historically had been a theater, and so technically it was an adaptive reuse because of how it had been suffering over the years and vacant for some time, and then this was perceived as a, yes, let's fix it up. This was the historical photograph, and we'll come back to this a lot because you can kind of guess that this is a real big pile of Beaux-Arts and a nice big theater marquee, and it shows it on some point in the early days of its existence. What happened to it, and this is not the after, this is the before, somebody, after the theater failed, turned it into ground floor retail and basically completely removed the facade below the primary cornice. So this is the condition it was in for probably the majority of its life until a few years ago. And the proposed design was to basically remove all the later non-compatible alterations to the ground floor and mezzanine, and then restore to within an inch of its life all of the Beaux-Arts filigree above that. And the way that the architect pursued this was to, let's just say, make a clear differentiation between what was new construction and what was original construction. This image, I think, pretty clearly shows that. But I'll stay with the role of being a presenter. So this is where the original marquee was. Obviously, the conscious decision was not to return the building in any way to the appearance of the original construction. And in this case, you're really looking at what the architect believed was an exceptionally detailed steel and glass construction that was a bit disengaged from what was above. That's a distant view from the main facade, and you can see it really only goes back to a punched opening motif at the very right side where there is that one marquee relevant, and that is aligning below the last group of window openings on that side. The interiors, we just included this image, I think, because the bongos look nice and the chairs were all different. But otherwise, some of the spaces are pretty unremarkable, like this one. And the detailing, on the other hand, this is an exterior view, but this would be an interior view, was really exceptionally made. The steel and the glass connections, and in fact how the cross bracing for the moment frames was handled. I think was handled very successfully. Obviously, the modernist ethos was what was at work here, and in some of the cases, the detailing sort of overwhelmed the space in some degree. The level of design of the building was almost as relevant in the detail of the cross bracing, like this image, as it was for the building itself. This was again that little entrance at the towards the rear, where they had their residual marquee going in, and in some ways this has probably the least to do with either the original building or with the dramatic change of the base. I'm sorry, I misspoke. This is what they ended up with, and it replaced. This was the marquee that they started with, as had been altered. So that is how that went together. Otherwise, it was a complete redesign. It's a performing arts and center and educational group, and so you have a variety of different people using the space. And I think that's about that. This would be the interior of the space, which is the auditorium under construction. And this is as it was completed. So I think that's the last, this is the last. You can see one other key feature that the architect was very fond of, and this was one of the design features that got brought up in the review phase, was, for instance, partly to avoid conflicting with the windows, but here they consciously made an effort to install the new theater risers, for instance, for the seating, by pulling them back from the not just the facades, but from the walls on any of the sides, so that it was perceived as an insertion of an object into the space rather than modifying the space by running it end to end. So with that,
question, Taylor, is the ground floor now retail or part of the theater spaces?
Part of the theater spaces. They have no retail left in this. It was totally absorbed within their performing arts programming.
Taylor, there's a second question actually. Was this a federal historic tax credit project?
I don't think so. I don't think that, I think it had local funding behind it, but I don't believe that it had a tax credit base to it. Because as I recall, that same question came up, and I think the point was that they had funding from other sources, and I think they also believe that they may not necessarily have succeeded in a tax credit for this. Certainly the amount of the alteration of the ground facade, although it has removed, I know in a similar project that I was involved with in Riverside, the issue was the diagonal cross bracing. When it went to SHPO for review, the comment was, we don't like to look at diagonal cross bracing, least of all through glass storefront that basically spans the facade. That was held to address that issue.
I think it's an interesting project in the sense of adaptive reuse, because we sort of gravitate oftentimes to the historic image that shows us sort of the building in perhaps its purest form, or the point at which it had the highest level of integrity, and then we can clearly see what happened to it later.
Yeah.
Okay, this is John. I'm just going to step in here. There's some people speaking on the phone conference line. Would you mind please muting your phone? Thank you.
So we can see what happened later, obviously, to obliterate the ground floor, and a sense here of bringing part of it back. Interesting here is, again, where I think the original design was maybe open more at the corner and then had a more solid area in the middle of that elevation. Again, it's always a question of, you know, whether the program needs kind of outweigh the architectural needs. And in this case, there was clearly a sense of making the ground floor as open as possible, perhaps whether it's retail or highlighting the uses on the interior. But I think, you know, the fact that the architect picked up on what was some of the original condition at the front and corner, I think is quite good, and then took that to a more contemporary form in opening up the storefront.
The other thing that, go ahead, Barbara.
I think it's a vast improvement on the opacity of the previous version. There is kind of an attitude of the entire upper story being lifted on pilotis above the ground, and it would have been nice to see maybe some more expression of load continuing to the ground. But I do applaud that, you know, the spirit of like a sense of vitality on the ground floor has been explored in the adaptive reuse.
Right. As a composition, Barbara, I think it does appear a little top-heavy, but again, it's that sort of desire to have visual openness.
But it's also kind of an interesting reference back to the commercial storefronts in the late 19th century where you had brick masonry, massive stuff above a cast iron facade, which maximized the span, you know, for the glazing. And it does sort of pick that up in how the upper kind of balcony level of the ground floor is rendered differently with the closer spaced vertical mullion windows. It sort of gives you at least a transition, if you will, from big, large amounts of glass to smaller amounts, and then you have the big, solid massiveness above. In one sense, at first glance, you look at it and you think, what better definition of soft story could you want? You know, although in theory it's probably far heavier below than it is above. I mean, it is a masonry structure, though. But I think the primary issue that came out as this was presented in Oakland was it's really a mashup of two really disconnected buildings, and that if you had tried, I think Tim Brandt asked the question, was this submitted for tax credit? And the answer was, well, no. And I think everybody kind of had the understanding that there was no way it would have qualified because it was so radically different than what had been there before, and that it was not really, it didn't add to the notion of a rehabilitation. It was a really vastly different design. And although there was nothing left to restore, I mean, one of the theories would be, yes, you could have restored it to its original condition, but part of the premise of the Oakland Performing Arts Group was that they wanted to have a place where the kids could go and perform, like you saw the piano through the window in one of the earlier shots. Those are all, in effect, performing spaces, not just a theater that you don't quite see from the street, but these are all places where, in theory, when you're walking down the street, you see somebody in there doing a dance recital or rehearsal or playing instruments in a group or something like that. So the idea of it, I think, is conceptually kind of interesting, but I think architecturally, it really, however brilliantly detailed it is, it really does not look like it goes with that building terribly well.
Hey, Taylor. This is John again. I was wondering if the bottom level, were there any reasons structurally or safety-wise to design it in that way?
No, I think it was, from their perspective, what they were showcasing was, yeah, here are the big concrete columns, and yet we've disengaged the glass facade with front glazed corners and so on, and that they've just taken a real modernist approach to still reveal parts of the building, and then at a certain point cut it away and say, okay, the rest of it, here's this building looming above. So it certainly was structurally, yes, it was it had necessity of all the diagonal cross bracing you saw, but that again was part of the aesthetic of a real modern approach to otherwise what is still in large amounts of both our style buildings.
Okay, we have no further questions. Does anybody have any questions? If so, please type them in the chat box right now. If there are no further questions, it doesn't appear people are asking questions. We can move on to the next case.
Okay.
And John, do I now control the screen, or how does this work?
Barbara, you could either do it or I could. If you'd like, just indicate to me and I'll do it for you.
I'll do it. Hi, everyone. This is kind of a success story followed by a challenge. John, oh, there they are. Okay, good. I'm going to be talking about the buildings on the 35-acre Crystal Cathedral campus, which include two buildings by Richard Neutra, the very famous 1901 structure by Johnson, a visitor by Richard Meyer, and then a secondary center that nobody seems to know much about, at least in popular culture, is a very large building by Long on the east side of the campus. So I've been involved with a rehabilitation of the Neutra, the famous drive-in church, and also the adjacent Tower of Hope that was designed and constructed 6 years after the 1962 that Neutra designed. So when the Catholic Church, yep.
Hi, Barbara. Sorry, it's very quick. I was hoping you could increase your volume somehow. People are saying you're quiet right now.
Adjust volume.
That would help.
Better, folks?
There you go. Sure.
Yes, much better.
Hello? Okay. In the interest of time, I won't repeat myself much, but with regard to the Neutra structure, the church, the Catholic Church presumed initially that it would probably be about $2 million to rehabilitate the structure. And in fact, when discovery proved very early that the building had no reason or right to be standing, both of the long window walls were in danger of collapsing. On the west, which you can't see in the windows down to a little bit similar to the you see parallel to the masonry wall there, and the lower west wall was timber wall covered with plywood, and that was completely dry rotted, so much so that when they started to dismantle it for reconstruction, the entire length of the window wall started swaying back and forth. There were other critical concerns with regard to seismic enforcement. The cross bracing specified by Neutra and his architect on the north end, which is to the immediate right of the orange panel, had never installed. So further compromise lateral reinforcement of the building. So that could open the door for redoing the windows, which were single pane and later bronze film tinted, to completely redo all the fenestration. So architects did hundreds of sketches and ideas to ultimately facilitate dual pane windows that are low E, super efficiency, and they are also filmed in such a way to preserve Neutra's original design intent of transparency, but still reduce the solar gain, because the long sides of the buildings are east-west, which is kind of anathema in sighting. You don't want to have glass on the east and west like they are here. And in fact, it was a very poor condition because the space had never been air conditioned, despite Neutra's efforts in ventilation. Apparently, people were so imposed on by the solar and the sun that some of them wore sunglasses inside the sanctuary. So in addition to the glass replacement, they also, the initial idea was to put air conditioning units on the top of the roof. At that point, the architects LPA elected to resign the commission because they believed that such an imposition on a long horizontal plane would be utterly absurd. So with that threat, the developer kind of responded with, well, it's that important. I trust you guys to make that right decision. So what happened with air conditioning now below grade and continues on to the addition that you see a white volume on the right of this image. And on the very right, you see the walls being dismantled. The other thing that the architects did for seismic reinforcement was that all the original columns that you see, the vertical columns, they were I columns. So that gave the architect the opportunity to insert on either side of within the I column, square columns, square cubes from roof to ceiling, so that that also provided size reinforcement that way. So let's see, next one. Here you see the emptied sanctuary, and the rehabilitation effort more than doubled the cost of the project. The developer became a kind of a passionate lover, and we were able to rehabilitate that bright panel that you see in the background. There's a tool for drawing attention to Schuler, who would be addressing the 6-part cars outside of the structure, and so Neutra was employing both aesthetics to draw attention to Schuler's moving figure there. And in the front you see others who are transplanting the boulder that Schuler brought home from the Holy Land and that had been kind of discarded all throughout the campus. So we reinstated them according to historic photographs by Julia Schulman. So the final project, the final project restores that orange panel. It makes the sanctuary very viable. It now holds 30 masses a week with a total of 912,000 people a year worshiping in that sanctuary. And in kind of contrast to us who might genuflect at the architecture with a kind of hushed attitude, you should see people crawling over every surface, so much so that the maintenance schedule includes painting white of the interior planes every month and painting the brown interiors every other month. There you see the restored interior. It doesn't have it no longer has the asymmetrical lighting from above that it used to, but the architects have also kind of amplified Neutra's ideas about contrast and combining serenity with a kind of kinetic attitude, and that was also part of his Gestalt aesthetic. For the rest of the project, I'm going to back a little bit and talk a little bit about what I've learned about proposed changes to the actual Crystal Cathedral, which, as you may recall, is a 78,000 square foot, and it's the largest glass building in the world. There's 10,000 panes of mirrored single pane glass. That is closed until 2015 when the renovation, it's not a rehabilitation, is concluded. And the Catholic Church promised the Crystal Cathedral Ministries that they would not change the exterior. But because of the liturgical needs of Catholic worship, where light and shadow and procession from exterior to interior, very much in the tradition of kind of ancient Greek worship of in temples, but this need for procession, to have light and shadow, to have the sense of ediculae and baldachines, kind of interior coverings to reduce this enormous scale, is the imperative right now. So they are right in the middle of the design process to start looking at ways to accomplish this while not disturbing the exterior shell. And that may include fabric panels, interior and exterior. They are going to be removing the very large water element that bisected the interior space to reduce humidity and to unify the interior sanctuary. They're going to be dismantling the organ, which is at a huge cost, and that's being shipped back to Italy for a complete restoration. But right now, the architecture by Johnson Sain and the landscaping by Rios Clemente Hale is still much undecided and in process. And of course, the Rios Clemente Hale's design brief is to unify the campus with this incredibly disparate and eclectic group of buildings that nonetheless kind of do comprise a historic district.
Very interesting.
Okay, Barbara, are you, is that all?
Yeah, that's about it. I mean, the important thing is to recognize that the Catholic liturgy, the communion and the Eucharist is the center part of the service, in great contrast to the Dutch Reformed Church that Schuller was part of, which is all about this Protestant ethic of light. So it's interesting to consider throughout religious architectural history how we treat light and shadow. So that's the big challenge for the Catholic Church right now. That's it.
Make it. It's another building they're not even showing there.
Okay, great. Lambert and Taylor, are you still there?
We're here. I had a question for Barbara. Is there a thought to keep the parking lot, since that was such an important feature of the building?
They show the cities or they...
Yeah, so far, no question about the parking lot, but I think that's correct, Lambert, but I'm not 100% sure.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're right, you're bringing up the role of the setting.
Right, the setting of the building, and maybe the Catholic Church will reconsider their ceremony to include seating in your car.
Well, it could be part of the confessional, I guess.
Or part of the confessional. A little Vatican humor.
Yeah, I think that what was interesting about this and why it was sort of obvious for the Orange conferences is we were planning it, the sale of this to the Catholic Church had just been announced. And so the thought was at least introduce it as what do you do with a building where it literally is a transparent, talking right now about the Johnson design, it's a totally transparent structure from inside. And at the same time, how do you make, as you said, Barbara, very correctly, the sense of the professional and the light and the shadow, where instead you're in an interior volume that has no differentiation for that type of thing. So this was the liturgical difference that I thought would be really interesting to see about how far could you tweak a building without necessarily changing its character or characteristics, especially as viewed from the outside. It's almost like it's a curtain wall building with the church function that did before when it was designed. It didn't matter. It was part of the expansiveness, I guess, that was the design. A really different liturgical process to address. So it'll be interesting to see how the rest of that does get modified over time. It's a long process. Sure. Yeah, that image on the upper right shows that from the interior. It's just, you can't imagine how do you make that liturgically appropriate for Catholic Mass. And the consequence of having the Nicolangelo's St. Peter's plan there was that was a previous change of when you moved the altar to the main crossing rather than being more hidden. That was maybe one of the first steps that led us ultimately to Philip Johnson.
Okay, at this moment we're going to open it up to questions in relation to this particular case study. I typed a prompt in the chat box. If anybody has any questions, please type your question right below that.
Yeah. If you're ever in Southern California, you have to see that site. Yeah, I wouldn't know where it's at. You can see a Disneyland.
Okay, it appears we have no questions on this particular project, so we're going to move on to the lightning round.
How have you guys been into this since they remodeled?
Okay, I'm going to take the on this one because this has been in the press really since last April. But on January 8th this year, the Museum of Modern Art officially announced that they would be demolishing the Todd Williams and Billy Finn Museum of American Folk Art. And if I don't know how many people are familiar with the development of Manhattan and the fact of it's a constant rebuilding of itself. But the first thought that I had was being very familiar with the brownstones that had been there, and that there was certainly no outcry when they were removed to build the Museum of the American Folk Art. So this image is showing you the particular houses that actually were demolished when the Museum of Modern Art expanded to the west in the mid-'80s to build their first big grand tower. The structure you see on the right is the design that was built from, actually I think it was in design from 1997 and was completed in 2003. And the concept of this was the Museum of American Folk Art had been in a brownstone that was on that site, which the people who were directing the museum directed Todd and Billy to design for them kind of a statement structure, which they certainly did. It's made of bronze panels that were individually cast and assembled in such a way, and it's quite a beautiful facade. The image you see on the right there shows it probably in one of its best lights, where it reflects light beautifully on the north side of the street. The problem with the building was that it always leaked. It had huge issues with how this facade and how the museum actually worked. The other problem with it, frankly, was that it was a very expensive building to build, and ultimately, prior to the financial crush, the Museum of American Folk Art took on a tremendous amount of debt to build a statement building for themselves. And in effect, it bankrupted the museum, so ultimately it closed a couple of years ago, and the Museum of Modern Art bought it and its 40-foot site in 2011. So you have a context shot here on the left, which shows the Folk Art Museum in the left foreground, and then the previous edition that took out the brownstones you saw in the first image is that glass tower you see rising up into the sky. That was a Cesar Pelli design structure, and it was the first real estate move by Museum of Modern Art to expand their galleries to some degree, but basically to have 40 or 50 floors worth of condominiums for sale above it. So it certainly helped their endowment. The issue with this, besides it being kind of topical, is the New York firm Diller, Scofido, and Renfro did a design for how would you now expand this the Museum of Modern Art further to the west, which would replace Todd and Billy's Folk Art Museum. And this was fairly recently revealed. And in fact, I encourage anybody to look this up. On this past weekend, there's a piece in the New York Review of Books written by Martin Stiller, and it's I would read it at length, but that's not what we're supposed to do here today. But basically, it calls into question, first of all, the decision to demolish the building by MoMA, that it was a predicted outcome all along, and kind of a false sense of why would you demolish this building, because, well, we just can't make it work. I think the direct quote from Elizabeth Diller was that she said that they, and I'm quoting her from a New York Times article, to save the building, we had to lose too much of the building. And knowing how many facadectomies that we've seen over the decades, really, in effect, you couldn't imagine why the Museum of Modern Art would find it necessary to demolish the whole building to basically create what Martin Stiller says looks like a glorified entrance to a parking garage. Whether or not that's accurate, he certainly has a way with words. The other particular issue, in case you're not familiar with the Museum of Modern Art, is it's built over a series of decades, where there was the original structure in the complex is from the the 1940s, where the design of it became sort of a work in progress. And as one of the MoMA staffers said, the Museum of Modern Art is a perpetual work in progress. It's never been finished. And in fact, that's been one of the issues, that when you look at it on the street side, you have a series of buildings built over time. The 1936 to 39 facade was by Edward Durrell Stone and Philip Goodwin. And in 1964, a steel and glass edition was designed by Philip Johnson. Then you have the Cesar Pelli edition from the early 80s. And the Taniguchi's expansion in just around 2000, 2003. These are all really different looking buildings. So the idea of why you couldn't keep at least the facade of the Williams Todd building would seem to be kind of perplexing at best. So I thought this would be something good to have as a, well, here's current and what's relevant in what's what does create preservation issues, and not just how deteriorated or failed an older, turn of the century or turn of the previous century building is. In this case, this building was finished 12 years ago, not even. So the idea also is about what's the role of stewardship here, where in one case it's just as easy to decide that you're just going to demolish a building because you can increase your gallery space and do yet another residential tower. So I thought this was a really good topic for this, to sort of talk about the current events part of it, but also to address some key points, like what is the correct role of stewardship of buildings, and how do you have at times evaluation reports that kind of overstate or understate the amount of work or the amount of deterioration or the feasibility for incorporating any structure into new use or an adaptive reuse?
Well, I guess, Taylor, I'll jump in here. It's Lambert. I guess this raises the question, is there anyone else who loves this besides you? I mean, I think that, again, in our world of historic preservation, we're having difficulty stating things that are 45 years old, let alone 9 years old. And I think that, the larger question here is, has it really been identified as something worth saving versus, some in the architecture community like the building or like its history. I think it's raising a number of questions, which I think are certainly valid. I think in the kind of 4-stage process that we go through with preservation, has it been identified? If so, is it something that we can actually retain to then protect and ideally preserve, as opposed to another facet, with contemporary construction and contemporary architecture, and the American sort of culture, if you will, of throw it away. It served its purpose, as limited as it was. It failed, literally, and now we're going to throw it away and we're going to build something new, which will that new thing be loved? Again, if we're looking at our 40 or 50-year rule, if you will, will that survive? Perhaps it only lasts 10 years and MoMA decides that there's a new flavor and that's what they need.
Well, and that's the point of Manhattan, and it's in a constant state of, demolition and reconstruction. And there's very little that you could imagine that on the big scale of things, well, why does this particular building matter so much? I think it has as much to do with, the Museum of Modern Art was about modern art and architecture. And the original international style building was meant to sort of serve as the standard for how modern architecture could be perceived and considered as the wave of the future. And here we have a case where it's not that the building it failed, it certainly did. In fact, it failed its institution by putting them into such debt and having a poor. It really was never successful. The only part that is successful is that it has, like the image on the right, nice bronze panels that reflect light beautifully in the afternoon. Isn't it nice? But as a building, I think you have to separate the notion of preservation of building from preservation of what's the building for. And certainly, I don't have any great love for the museum from the interior point of view. I think it's an attractive facade. But to suggest that a study was made that suggested that we just can't preserve enough of the building, so we have to demolish the whole thing, that...
right, which is often a concept that we see in preservation, absolutely, where the contractor says it can't be done. But it's really a question of, if there's a will, there's a way. And again, in some cases, there isn't an appropriate methodology.
And that's why this was, I thought, a really interesting point, because you usually see that kind of rhetoric applied to at least 50 or maybe 100 years old or more structure, but here it's to a building that was finished 14 years ago. What's the problem? And it's also what happens when you have the modernist issue of, well, not just does it have sufficient time on this planet to be appreciated and realized, but what is the conservation and preservation of modern on top of the historical and revival style structures from decades previous. It's similar and it's really, really different. So, Barbara?
I think partly because it hasn't been identified as significant other than a completely impassioned architectural press. I'm a little bit baffled on why we're even talking about this building, I guess, because I'm not sure how significant it is in its context and to the city of New York. I would think that the architects of the new, Diller Scofido, they apparently are close friends of Todd and Williams, and they've made every effort to think of ways to reuse the building. I find it hard to believe, actually, Phil's comment that they didn't try hard enough. So that's my comment on this.
Oh, hi Barbara, this is John again. We had a question come up in relation to your last case study that you were presenting, so I thought this would be a good time to ask.
Oh?
The question was, how is this complex of modern buildings, or how do they get a historical rating?
What do you mean a historical rating? They've never been identified. They've never been presented, or in fact, they don't want to go for National Register or California Register recognition. All of the rehabilitation that the church is doing has been largely without purview of, there's been no review of government authorities or anything like that. So, but I was suggesting that this collection of buildings, as disparate and eccentric as it is, does comprise a historic district, maybe not under Criterion C, but because of their relationship to Robert Schuller.
Okay, that was the only question actually. Should we move on to the next case study then, or it looks like we still have about 15 minutes since we went a little over trying to set up the audio. For the people that wouldn't mind staying on, feel more than free to. So should we present this last two lightning round case studies and see how far we can make it?
I was interested, did Taylor have any follow-up comments, or Lambert, with regard to the significance of the Folk Art Museum?
No, not that I would have.
I don't have anything further. So, mostly because it was also in the press fairly recently, because it just opened. Renzo Piano, who seems to be doing a lot of museums these days, has this edition, and this aerial photograph shows it beautifully. And if you're not familiar with the Kimball, it's a Louis Kahn's building that was completed shortly before he passed in the early 70s. And it is the structure in the far left in the image here that has a series of barrel vaulted roof lines. And Piano's expansion is obviously in the center. And the idea with this had to do more with, what would be an appropriate way of considering how is this building similar and compatible or sufficiently differentiated. I know that in the early 80s, when they had their previous case of we don't have enough room, they commissioned Aldo Giurgola, who had taught with Kahn at Penn, to design an addition to the Kimball, which basically continued some of the vaulting and the massing, not exactly the detail of the vault, but it was a physical attachment to the Kimball itself. And he was absolutely pilloried for doing this work, including Sue Ann Kahn, who, you know, Aldo knew her well. And she, you know, in a public presentation in New York in the early 80s, just lit into him for how dare he even consider adding. So I guess the question of this is, when you were adding to such a, you know, revered landmark, how far away do you need to be? And, you know, is any addition to it appropriate? And maybe lastly, is this a successful structure from the standpoint of what are you trying to achieve? It's, when you look at that image of it that was recently in the Wall Street Journal, you couldn't tell, you know, what it's referring to, if anything. But when you look at the context shot, you kind of can perceive, oh, okay, I see what he's doing. He's really reinterpreting Kahn's vaulting, and so therefore it's sort of a compatible kind of thing. And then that berm you see to the right hides a very large theater, so it kind of goes with the current concept of adding to, especially museums, because the collections always seem to grow. Most additions that have happened in the last couple of decades tended to be underground, so that the limit on the impact was significant. So, thoughts?
It's a fairly successful addition to the property. I think that, you know, the difficulty is always in the next phase of expansion. Let's hope the brilliant idea is not to connect the two buildings. That would be a much more difficult proposition.
Yeah, it seems like it's a respectful distance.
Yeah, it is. In fact, it picks up on some of the roof form skylights. Yeah, certainly seems compatible.
And yet you're not replicating exactly the barrel vaulting that Kahn had done and was studied in great detail, both structurally and lighting and mechanically. I don't know that much about Piano's work in this building, but it's probably not a lot different from the LACMA building that he finished a few years ago. But I think that the notion of how do you add, I mean, in a sense, this recalls what was changed at the Salk Institute, where there's a contemporary building addition that took out this grove of trees that you walked through when you went from the parking lot to the Salk Center. And now it's got a structure to it. But it's similar in that there's no direct physical attachment, but at the same time, there's sort of a respectful distance so that you can appreciate the value of each of the building compositions.
Okay, so a question came up from Judith. Why is the value of a building so focused on the public right-of-way exterior, especially when it may not be the most significant design feature or innovation of the building?
It's a good question. I think probably it's like what they tell people on historic district reviews. No one's reviewing what you're doing on the inside of the building, but if what you're doing on the inside affects the exterior fenestration in any way, that is a reviewable point. So I think the first impression might be the other way of looking at it, that what you're seeing on the building is what you see on the outside. And I know when I first went into the Kimball, you know, a year or two after it opened, I kept thinking, oh, what beautiful, nice, you know, barrel vaults. And then you go inside, and you're right, Judith. When you go inside, there's this inverted version of the same roof where it looks like the light fixture and diffuser in the center penetrates the barrel vault. But from the outside, you just don't see that. So on the outside, you have a kind of predictable way of understanding the building as a collection of barrel vaults. But when you go inside, every single barrel vault is voided at the top center of the vault, which is structurally what is the most necessary part of a vault. So it had this real interesting paradox of how it was built, and you would never see it from the outside. So it is like I think part of the process of how do you understand and appreciate architecture as you perceive the building, move to the building, then as you move around within the building, you're always wanting to have sort of surprises like that. And I think that a lot of the attention paid in review and analysis, and as an example, the Wall Street Journal article didn't have any picture of the interior. It had the exterior shot. You know, so you have a different understanding, of course, when you actually get there.
Okay, so we have a second question regarding the same building, I think. Preservation Brief 14 discusses the concept of subordination in design, scale, and materials. Would you provide further exposition on how to apply subordination in design relative to a historic resource?
Well, I think subordinate can... I'm sorry, John?
I was going to say that question is also in the chat box in case you need to reference it.
I mean, to make something subordinate, I think the first step is often the scale and massing of the new addition, and whether in the case of an addition to the building, I think that's sort of one level and approach. When it's one of the examples we saw earlier, in addition to the property as a separate building, or the one that we're at now, I think the issues of scale tend to be a little bit different, where it's maybe more a question of massing, so that something is not overwhelming, the addition is not overwhelming the historic resource. I think it's also important to identify what the character defining features are of the resource, so that one can sort of, you know, weigh those relative to the new addition, and you know, how are those character defining features going to be enhanced or not overwhelmed with the new addition.
And I know that in one sense the question of subordination, this is a sloping site, and as it goes to the north, and what looks like the piano's expansion is on that higher side, but it also looks like it's a much taller building. So, you know, that and the modification of the grade to, and you know, have grass being the roof of the theater. I mean, you're trying to diminish it as much as you can by doing those sorts of, you know, varying techniques. Yeah, but ultimately, you know, this is hard when it's such, you know, a tall structure. It's hard to kind of perceive it here as a figure in it whatsoever, but it's probably, I wouldn't say twice as, certainly it's half again as tall as the Kimball, but it's also a higher stretch of the site. So the subordination would be, it looked like I do as much as he could, he still went for the majestic height of the spaces. And in the Kimball, con spaces are a lot more intimate as a result of that, more a humanly scaled vault.
I'm going to allow a quick opportunity for Barbara to mention anything she'd like, because there's a bit of background noise on your microphone, Barbara, so I just muted you. Do you have any comments?
Yes, I do. Hang on. Yes, I do, and I'd like to go to Kevin's chat box. You know, I pulled up on my other monetization brief work, and you know, Kevin's comment has to do with not a scale and mapping, but design, and this is where I have to depart as well, because piano's design is clearly not important to anyone. It's monumental. It's extremely monumental. Very, very strong, and with these columns that are scaled, it is a completely different effect and full quality of the con building in terms of design, however meritorious the scale and mapping, because they seem very comparable in this one photograph I'm looking at. It almost looks like so took the curvature of Collins walls and kind of them up. So in terms of the easy things, separating it physically and respectfully and on messing, it acquits subordination perfectly, but not me in terms of design.
Yeah, looking at it also is that clearly you're not at the conference building because it's now way too sacrosanct, but at the same time you create a situation where you're now building a campus of buildings that are all discrete little objects, very much like LACMA's campus has turned out to be. So I think that's also one of those issues, that if you're going to have a collection of these brilliant jewel-like buildings, what's the overall master plan? And as Lambert said earlier, what are the character-defining features? And then how do you reinterpret them? Or how do you interpret them in a way that is both allowing the new design to happen and to happen in the way that works, but to not be so much a bad neighbor to the Kimball itself.
Right, because as Barbara said, I mean, the question of scale here, I mean, this is potentially very massive, so there is no subtlety.
No.
And often, going back to the Painted Ladies example, there could have been a greater subtlety. It wasn't all that bad, but, that's where it, beyond sort of concept, it's all a question of execution. And as Barbara said, this is a design that probably just wants to be on its own. It could care less about being next to.
If it was across the street, it would be better.
Well, you'd probably have to drive to get there.
Yeah, but this ultimately gets to the question of what is an addition? Is it an addition because it's on the same site or across the street or nearby or connected in an underground garage or what?
Right, or it's similar to the LACMA example where it's sort of a collection of widely different buildings that don't necessarily add up to a greater whole.
Depending if they can demolish them all in time to build the next new.
Well, that's true.
So unless there's any other comment, John, why don't we finish up with the last one?
Okay, my thoughts are we should finish this up very soon because we're coming up on 90 minutes. So move through this one quickly, and then we'll do the poll very quickly.
Right. So this, I'm going to just present this one because I know all about this in a sense. This is in 1980s. This is in the early 80s. A firm in New York called Vorsanger and Mills designed an addition to the Morgan Library, and this is under construction. The library itself is this sort of the house is the residence. The original residence for Morgan is at the left, the sort of grayer building, and then he had his library built while he was still alive on the right, and the idea was to connect the two, and Vorsanger Mills did this, and that's the only image we have of this. This is the Renzo Piano, once again, has designed this building. At least this one doesn't look as prickly as the one at the Kimball, but what the issue was, I think, and why this was of relative interest is what are the different ways that you can expand to a building over time that works or not. And in the Vorsanger Mills case, when I went there shortly after it was finished, it was awful. It was this curving structural steel bit, and it had absolutely nothing to do with anything, but the form was also especially odd and struggling against the very formal neoclassical buildings that were there. And what Renzo Piano got right this time was, I think, in terms of color, and how it's a very simple, elegant box just like the rest, but it's obviously completely modern. It's completely devoid of any neoclassic references. So this is more to the realm of how do you expand this, and that was the idea of this. And was this a successful expansion? And if so, why? And if so, why not?
It's like a marquee, and it's just missing the I might have used similar materials but different designs.
Okay, Taylor, so are we done here, or should I move on to the closing comments?
Any other comments? Yeah. In the interest of time, we can leave it at that. It's a little slopey roof. Lambert, of course, Lambert prefers the voice anger to the Renzo piano.
Well, it creates a courtyard. This creates a box.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure it has to do with square footage.
Right, and this also did affect the courtyard. So in any event.
Okay,
John,
so I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. I apologize for the audio issues in the beginning. In 1 second here, there will now be a survey on your screen. I would like everybody, if they can, please complete the survey. I'm going to draw a circle around the response button. Oh, my apologies, that was a box. But in any case, please complete the survey response. It allows CPF to improve its programs. Really appreciate your time and feedback. I will also send an email with the final PowerPoint presentation and a link to the survey in case you cannot complete it now. We hope that you will register for the next webinar in preservation planning for small cities on February 25th. And please responses and have a great rest of the afternoon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.